She traveled 2,000 miles to marry him. He never wrote a single letter. When he found her dying in the blizzard, she whispered his name. The truth changed everything.
Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories' new emotional tales every day.
The wind howled like a wounded animal across the peaks of the Colorado Rockies on that December evening in 1887. Silas Thornton pulled his heavy fur coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he urged his horse, Jasper, through the deepening snow. He had lived alone in these mountains for 7 years, and he knew every warning sign the weather could offer. This blizzard would be a killer. Silas had made his choice long ago to live apart from the world below. After losing his family farm to drought and watching his younger brother Marcus take a dark path of gambling and dishonesty, he had retreated to the wilderness. Here, among the pine trees and the silence, he had found a kind of peace. He trapped furs, sold them twice a year in the distant town of Silver Creek, and otherwise kept his own company. It was a lonely life, but loneliness was safer than heartbreak. He was heading back to his cabin after checking his trap lines when Jasper suddenly stopped and refused to move forward. The horse whinnied nervously, pawing at the snow. Silas trusted his animal's instincts. He dismounted and walked forward through the swirling white curtain, his hand shielding his eyes from the biting wind. That was when he saw her. A woman lay crumpled beside a large boulder, her thin dress and traveling coat utterly insufficient for the brutal cold. Her lips were blue, and snowflakes had settled on her eyelashes. A small traveling case sat beside her, and clutched in her frozen fingers was a creased letter and a photograph. Silas felt his heart stop. For one terrible moment, he thought she was already dead. Then he saw the faintest rise and fall of her chest, and he sprang into action. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and she was cold as mountain stream water. He wrapped her inside his own coat against his chest, mounting Jasper with difficulty, and turned toward his cabin. The ride was treacherous. The storm intensified with every passing minute, but Silas knew these trails by memory. His only thought was reaching warmth before the fragile life in his arms flickered out entirely. He spoke to her constantly, though she could not hear him, words of encouragement tumbling from his lips, as if they could somehow keep her tethered to this world. His cabin appeared through the snow like a blessing. He carried her inside, laying her gently on his bed near the stone fireplace. The fire had burned low, so he built it up quickly, feeding it dry logs until the flames roared and heat began to fill the small space. Then he removed her frozen outer garments with trembling, careful hands, wrapping her in every blanket he owned. He heated water, prepared warm broth, and sat beside her through the long night. The storm screamed outside, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the door, but inside Silas kept his vigil. He studied her face in the firelight, noting the delicate features, the dark hair that had come loose from its pins, the small hands that looked like they had never done a day of hard labor. She was beautiful, but more than that, there was something about her that stirred feelings he had buried years ago. Near dawn, her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of spring leaves, green with flecks of gold, and they held confusion and fear as they focused on his face. Then, strangely, the fear seemed to melt into something else, recognition. She whispered a single word before unconsciousness claimed her again. That word was his name. Silas sat back, his heart pounding. She had said his name, but he had never seen this woman before in his life. How could she possibly know who he was? When she woke again, several hours later, she was stronger, Silas helped her sit up and drink some broth, watching her carefully. The color had returned to her cheeks, and though she was still weak, the terrible blueness had left her lips. "You saved my life," she said softly, her voice like music after years of silence. "I thought I would die out there." "What were you doing on that mountain in a blizzard?" Silas asked, keeping his voice gentle. "No wagon road runs through there. The nearest town is 20 miles away." Tears gathered in her eyes, and she looked down at her hands. "I was looking for someone. A man who promised to marry me. I came all the way from Philadelphia. I am a mail-order bride." Silas felt a strange tightness in his chest. Who was this man? She reached for her traveling case, which Silas had placed beside the bed. With trembling fingers, she withdrew a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and a photograph he had seen clutched in her hand. She held up the photograph to him, and Silas felt the world shift beneath his feet. It was his own face, looking back at him. The photograph had been taken 7 years ago, before he had come to the mountains, back when he had lived on the family farm, with hope still in his heart. He remembered the day it was taken. A traveling photographer had passed through town, and Marcus had insisted they both sit for portraits. "His name is Silas Thornton," she said, unaware of the storm raging inside him. "He wrote me such beautiful letters." He described his cabin in the mountains, his life trapping furs, the peace he had found away from the world. He said he was lonely and wanted a companion to share his life. I fell in love with his words before I ever saw his face. She paused, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I sold everything I had to make the journey. When I arrived in Silver Creek 3 days ago, I found his brother Marcus instead. He told me it had all been a lie. He was the one who wrote the letters, using his brother's photograph and his brother's life to lure me west. He said he had planned to marry me himself and take the money I brought. But he had lost it all gambling and could no longer afford a wife. He told me to go home." Her voice broke. "I had nothing, no money, no home to return to. I asked where the real Silas lived, thinking perhaps if I found him and explained, he might at least help me find work in town." Marcus laughed and pointed toward the mountains. He said his brother was a hermit who would probably send me away, but I had nowhere else to go. I started walking and got lost in the storm. Silas sat in stunned silence as the truth washed over him. His brother had stolen his identity, his photograph, his very life story to deceive this innocent woman. Marcus had always been selfish and cruel, but this betrayal cut deeper than any before. But tangled with his anger was something else. Something unexpected. This woman had fallen in love with his letters, she thought. She had fallen in love with descriptions of his life, his cabin, his solitude. She had crossed an entire country to find him, without even knowing he existed. "My name is Evangeline Hart," she said softly, wiping her tears. "I am so sorry to have intruded on your life. As soon as the storm passes, and I am strong enough, I will leave and trouble you no more." Silas stood and walked to the window, staring out at the wall of white. His mind was racing. For 7 years he had lived alone, convincing himself that solitude was what he wanted. But in the space of one night, everything had changed. This woman, this stranger, had been sent to him by the cruelest twist of fate, and yet somehow it felt like destiny. He turned back to face her. "Those letters Marcus wrote," he said carefully. "What did they say?" Evangeline pulled one from the bundle and read aloud. Her voice was soft and full of the emotion she had felt when first reading those words. The letter spoke of watching the sun set over the mountains, of the satisfaction of building something with your own hands, of longing for someone to share quiet evenings by the fire. It spoke of believing that somewhere in the world there was a person meant for each of us, if only we were brave enough to seek them. Silas listened with growing wonder. Those were not Marcus's thoughts. Marcus had never watched a sunset in his life. Marcus had never built anything or valued anything he could not spend. No, Marcus had simply observed his older brother and stolen his soul for profit. Everything in those letters, Silas said slowly, every feeling, every hope, every description of this cabin and this life, those are my truths. Marcus may have written the words, but he stole them from me. He watched me live this life, and he copied it down to trap you. Evangeline stared at him, understanding dawning in her green eyes. You mean, the man I fell in love with through those letters, the man I traveled across the country to find, he was always you? Silas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The storm raged for 3 more days. During that time, Silas cared for Evangeline as she regained her strength. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their disappointments. Silas learned that Evangeline had been a school teacher in Philadelphia, that she had lost both parents to illness, and that she had answered the advertisement for a mail-order bride because she had nothing left to lose and everything to hope for. In turn, Silas told her about the farm, about watching his parents work themselves into early graves, about Marcus's betrayals that had cost them everything, and about his retreat to the mountains. He had thought he was running away from pain, but now he wondered if he had simply been waiting for her. On the 4th day, the storm broke, and the sun emerged to transform the world into a glittering wonderland of white. Evangeline stood at the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass, and spoke without turning around. I should go to Silver Creek and find work. Perhaps they need a school teacher. I cannot continue to impose on your kindness. Silas stood behind her, close enough to see the slight trembling of her shoulders. Is that what you want? He asked quietly. To leave? She turned to face him, and he saw the tears she was fighting to hold back. What I want does not matter. I came here under false pretenses, believing I was to be your bride. But you made no such promise. You owe me nothing. Silas reached out and gently took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her since carrying her through the blizzard, and he felt something pass between them, like lightning. When Marcus stole my photograph and my words, he said, he did it out of greed. But perhaps something greater was at work. Perhaps this was always meant to happen, just not the way anyone expected. You came here to marry a man named Silas Thornton, a man who lives alone in the mountains and longs for companionship. Evangeline, I am that man. She looked up at him, hope and fear battling in her eyes. What are you saying? I am saying that I have been alone for 7 years, and I never once felt lonely until you said you were leaving. I am saying that you fell in love with the truth of who I am, even though it came wrapped in lies. I am saying that if you are willing to stay, not as an obligation or out of desperation, but because you choose to, then I would like the chance to earn your love properly, the way it should have been from the beginning. Evangeline's tears finally fell, but she was smiling through them. I have nowhere to go, nothing to offer you but myself. That is everything, Silas said simply. That is more than I ever dared to hope for. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Silas had ever experienced. Evangeline brought light into his cabin in ways he had never imagined. She reorganized his cluttered shelves, filled the space with her laughter, and proved herself far stronger than her delicate appearance suggested. She learned to help with the traps, to cook over an open fire, and to read the weather signs that could mean life or death in the mountains. And slowly, carefully, they fell in love. It was not the love of the letters, which had been built on deception. It was something realer and deeper, forged in shared labor, quiet conversations, and the growing certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they had been missing. In the spring, when the snow began to melt and the first wildflowers pushed through the earth, Silas took Evangeline down the mountain to Silver Creek. They married in the small church there, with the whole town as witnesses. The preacher spoke of providence and fate, of how love could find a way through even the darkest storms. On their way out of town, they passed the saloon, and Silas saw a familiar figure slumped at the bar through the window. Marcus looked up, and for a moment, the brothers' eyes met. There was no anger in Silas's gaze, only a strange kind of gratitude. Marcus had meant to cause harm, but instead, he had given his brother the greatest gift of his life. Silas helped Evangeline onto the wagon seat and climbed up beside her. He took the reins in one hand and her hand in the other. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked. Evangeline looked at the mountains rising before them, the pine trees swaying gently in the spring breeze, and the endless blue sky that seemed to promise nothing but good things to come. "I am already home," she said. "I have been since the moment you found me in that blizzard." They rode up a mountain together, leaving the town and its shadows behind. The cabin was waiting for them, smaller than any house in Philadelphia, but filled with more love than Evangeline had ever known. As they crossed the threshold together, Silas thought about all the years he had spent alone, all the silence he had convinced himself was peace. He had been wrong. Peace was not the absence of another person. Peace was finding the person who made your soul feel quiet and your heart feel full. Peace was Evangeline, standing in his cabin, looking at him with those spring green eyes and a smile that could melt any winter. "I love you," she said, and the words hung in the air like a blessing. "I love you," he answered, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Outside, the last of the snow dripped from the eaves, and somewhere in the forest, a bird began to sing. It was the sound of spring, of new beginnings, of a story that had started with deception and ended with the truest thing in the world. They had found each other against all odds, brought together by lies, but bound by truth. And as they stood in their cabin on the mountain, husband and wife, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The mountains had given Silas solitude, but Evangeline had given him something better. She had given him home.